These four builds, number 28, number 29, number 30, and number 49, all developed in prototype stages without a drivetrain, all originally intended to be the beneficiaries of the ultra-high performance options as prototypes, all intended for end use at the experimental garage for final development and testing. We're about to become the most historically significant Camaros ever built, and possibly the most historic four cars to ever be hand-built by General Motors.
Like all F-body pilot prototypes in Norwood, these prototypes started their hand-built assembly in consecutive VIN number order in the engineering study. All four were documented as Fleet and Special Order 5-9, made for national sales conventions and carried model number 12637.
This is the point that the XP836 design program gains a name. It's referred to as the F-car at that point because it's entering into a platform for manufacturing, but a working prototype has not been established yet. These pilot assembly prototypes were built by hand, one at a time until completion in a coach build atmosphere. These builds received components and parts that were marked prototype, handmade, and pilot production. This was done in secret in a World War II shipping building at the Norwood, Ohio General Motors plant. That's where 49 of these working prototypes were constructed. And because there had been no testing, no real-world engineering testing that had been done on these cars, 10 of those pilot prototypes were then sent to the proving grounds to make sure that they would be feasible in real-world applications. This is where our paper trail becomes conclusive, because we have the pre-production paperwork from all 49 of the Norwood working prototypes. These were the first of all of the F-car platform, but they still did not have a name. These cars were born without a name. They were referred to as the F-car.
The yellow and black coupes were scheduled as electric drive builds and ordered as a MIT powertrain. All four were delivered to the technical center approximately 3 weeks ahead of schedule. During the initial mock-up of number 28, number 29, 30, and 49 were used in a test emblem photographic study. All three photographic studies were trimmed like XP836 at the Tech Center. These three photo shoots were taken by GM Styling on a brisk Monday morning, June 20th, 1966. It was these three photo studies, some passing muster and others not, that ultimately led to the final choice of the name Camaro a week later. As evidenced in these photos, the name Panther was passed over, but other aspects were retained. Additionally, these photographic studies were the last Emblem study, prior to General Motors' final expense of $100,000 for tooling derived from the name choice. They could be evidenced in these photos with the clutch pedal missing, fake mock-up Rally Sport and Super Sport adornments, and electric elements hanging from the subframe. These four electric drive builds were artificially scheduled for deployment across the country at sales conventions, but were never actually seen by the public. They remained under the security of the General Motors Technical Center until the electric units were removed on site.
I was asked in 1963 by Don Friedman to recommend an electric drive for the Lunar Rover. And I right away recommended a DC version of my concept. This particular version ended up on the Rover test vehicle, which never made it to the moon, but which made it possible to reduce my concept to practice. When Delco Products built the electric drive for the three Apollo Lunar Rovers and the fourth one that ended up at the Smithsonian, they adopted the same concept as on the one on the Surveyor. There had been a reliability study using the Camaro as a test bed to find out how reliable would the Lunar Rover electric drive be in actual operation, using Camaro to do it. And I saw a brief reference in a memo from Walter Friedman stating that the reliability testing had been completed and everything was in good order and the information had been forwarded to the government and to government agencies.
Again, this was a way of navigating the GM restricted activities while utilizing multiple budgets for cost secrecy. These four Camaros were mocked up and tested until the second week of October 1966. That is when the proprietary testing components for the Lunar Roving Mobility Test Vehicle were removed, while the rest of the build was returned to its condition as a roller. From the interview of George Spix that resulted in episode 11, a colorful story was painted. When they announced that the division was going back to Warren, a lot of engineers quit. Those that didn't either went to Delco Products or were chosen to work with Pavliks. Well, Jalal and I came from nothing, and so we wanted our jobs. Hell, Jalal hadn't even been granted U.S. citizenship yet. So we packed up our families and moved right back to Warren. It was a mess in the beginning, and I got stuck with the jobs that no one else wanted to do. You know, Agrawal didn't care much for Jalal and I, so some of it was pretty bad. I got stuck with destroying Electrovare 1, and the damn car was just released. He would go on to say, another short straw was stripping those yellow Camaros down to make way for testing. We had no operating budget after Santa Barbara, so the cars were loaned to us. I had help disassembling them and putting the pieces in storage, but that was the easy part. When Agrawal told me to put them back together, I told him I was an electrical engineer, not an assembly line worker. That made things worse, so I didn't get any technicians to help me put them back together. So I brought tools from home and started putting them back together myself. I did my best, but a couple of them got their paint jobs pretty scratched up. George finally finished with. After I got them loaded, I had to accompany the driver to the garage in Milford. That's where the tongue lashing began. I found out those cars were scheduled for some type of high-performance build, and Mr. Jenkinson was really upset when he saw them. I even had a few loose parts laying in the trunk because everyone was in a rush. Our research learned from original documents that these 4 cars were sent to P.C. Jenkinson at the General Motors Experimental Garage on October 14, 1966. At the same time that this confidential General Motors program was wrapping up, a new high-performance program was being tested. It was the desire of Pete Estes to not only compete with the high-performance cars of the day, but dominate that sector of the car market. This would require that the new F-Car be promoted and optioned to the public with high-performance packages, and this became known as the legendary RPO Z28 package. Original documents and interviews showed that these 4 pilot prototype builds were originally intended for high-performance mock-up and testing, but because the testing of the electric drive vehicle components and the mobility systems were not completed on time, Vince Piggins and Pete Estes had understandably grown perturbed and impatient. And as documented in previous episodes, the General Motors Defense Laboratories operated outside of the eyes of all corporate governance, with the exception of Dr. Hofstadt. Because of this unexplainable delay, Mr. Piggins had chose to use an assembly line donor car for the first prototype of this high-performance option. That prototype test bed was created and delivered to the General Motors Proving Grounds on October 11th of 1966. It was a scheduled rebuild of vehicle 77055 and was delivered to the attention of Mr. Claire Caswell at the Proving Grounds. The endurance testing, as well as the performance testing, was received overwhelmingly by all that was involved. By October 17, 1966, internal memos were being circulated that the first prototype had passed the grade. It would be implemented with the exception of the installed and tested 283 cubic inch motor. It was decided during the performance testing that the RPO Z28 would utilize a 302 instead. Vehicle 77055 would ultimately be unveiled to the press in Riverside, California on November 26, 1966, and would ultimately be known from then on as the Riverside Z28. The initially scheduled 4 cars to be slated for the mock-up and testing of the prototype Z28 would prove to be quite an ordeal for the National Fleet Service Director, Mr. Tom Putnam. When the entirety of the electric drive testing for the Lunar Roving Mobility Test Unit was envisioned, it was intended to utilize loaned vehicles that could be returned without any signs of disassembly or usage.
That the Camaro was used by the people, the engineers who reduced my concept to practice as a test bed, because it was convenient, they didn't have to pay a lot of money for it, and they were able to do some testing on the Camaro, not of the electric drive concept for automobiles. It was for the electric drive concept used on the Lunar Rover, which was also a General Motors electric drive, which borrowed quite a bit from my concept. That's how the Camaro got into the picture, as a test bed for the Lunar Rover electric drive.
Consequently, the damage that George Spick spoke of proved to be quite a problem. Thomas Putnam had worked as the liaison for the electric drive division's involvements, and the budgetary responsibilities of mocking these vehicles up with the RPO Z28 package were the responsibility of the National Fleet Service Department. Internal documents obtained from the Putnam interview show that 2 of the 4 pilot prototypes, number 30 and number 49, were mocked up and tested at the General Motors Experimental Garage with the RPO Z28 package during the inactivity after the Proving Ground trials and the public release of 77055. This decision was made by Thomas Putnam in response to the damage that was evident on the remaining 2 cars. Although a factory mock-up document trail cannot be ascertained for the 2 remaining examples, it is known that number 29 was the car that was never finished by the General Motors Experimental Garage. Today, 3 of these examples still exist. Number 28 is scheduled for authentication and is pre-verified to be in possession of prototype assembly parts from the F-Car pilot program, as well as the General Motors experimental garage. It has General Motors shipping documents showing its transport to Dworkin Chevrolet in Derby, Connecticut, but its remaining history is still being unraveled. Number 29 was verified and certified in person during the summer of 2017 by Pilot Car Registry. This is the car that Thomas Putnam's memo conclusively omits from the RPO Z28 mock-up and testing. General Motors shipping documents show that this car was returned to corporate, Zone 0, where it was obviously sold as a roller without participating dealer involvement. This was ascertained by the complete lack of dealer-installed emblems, as these cars were built initially, prior to the name choice of the Camaro. It has a storied history as a highly competitive race car and is curated by a family that truly understands its significance. Number 30 is documented as being a beneficiary of the legendary RPO Z28 package, as an assembly and engineering prototype at the General Motors experimental garage. Mocked up and assembled approximately 60 days prior to regular assembly on the assembly line of the RPO Z28 package. Its existence has been lost since its documented transport to Dworkin Chevrolet as well. Number 49 also carries the same factory documented distinction, the beneficiary of the RPO Z28 package as an assembly and engineering prototype at the General Motors experimental garage. Additionally, it was the very last Norwood completed unit by VIN number of the pilot prototype engineering study. General Motors shipping documents show the transportation to the participating dealer RTR's High Performance Chevrolet in Yukon, Oklahoma. Ironically, the same dealer and close friend of Bunky Knudsen that received number 1, the very first Camaro ever built. A coincidence? I doubt it.